Over time, carrying metal itself became unnecessary. What began to matter was not the weight held in the hand, but the shared understanding that the weight existed somewhere else, secured and accounted for. This shift did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, with caution. People did not abandon metal because they trusted abstraction. They experimented with it because distance and risk made carrying wealth dangerous. Travel exposed metal to theft, loss, and violence. Leaving it behind reduced those dangers. Merchants began depositing metal with temples, treasuries, and trusted storehouses. These places already held social authority. They were associated with continuity, ritual, and record-keeping. In return for the deposit, a record was issued. At first, this record was nothing more than a reminder, a written acknowledgement that a certain amount of metal had been received and could be reclaimed later. The metal remained still. The claim moved. In the beginning, these records had no independent life. They were useful only to the person named on them. They could not be freely exchanged. Trust was still personal. The paper or tablet did not carry value by itself. It merely pointed back to something tangible. But habits form quietly. As the same storehouses honored the same records again and again, people began to trust the record as much as the metal it represented. Repetition reduced doubt. Over time, it became easier to hand over the record than to retrieve the metal itself. What mattered was access, not possession. Gradually, these records began to circulate. One person accepted a record not to reclaim the metal, but to pass it on. The recipient trusted that the storehouse would honor it if needed. The promise itself became transferable. Value moved without metal moving. This was a profound change, though it felt practical rather than philosophical at the time. Paper, clay, or parchment could travel faster and farther than metal. It could be hidden easily. It could be divided without melting. It reduced friction in exchange. These advantages were obvious in use, even if their implications were not fully understood. As records circulated, authority shifted again. Trust no longer rested solely on the material or the individual. It rested on the institution that stood behind the promise. The strength of that institution mattered more than the substance stored within it. This required new forms of discipline. Records had to be kept accurately. Claims had to be honored consistently. Disputes had to be resolved according to rules rather than memory. Writing became essential. Clerks, scribes, and accountants gained quiet importance. Their work ensured continuity. Errors were no longer small. A mistake in a ledger could affect many people. Precision became a moral requirement, not just a technical one. As systems matured, people grew accustomed to trusting what they could not see. They accepted that value might exist elsewhere, represented by marks and numbers rather than weight. This acceptance did not erase skepticism, but it softened it. Paper did not replace metal immediately. Both existed together for long periods. Some preferred the certainty of weight. Others preferred the convenience of record. Choice remained and trust shifted gradually. Over time, the record began to feel as real as the metal it represented. Money had moved another step away from the physical world, not because people desired abstraction, but because daily use rewarded it. Convenience shaped belief. Habit shaped trust. The invention of paper money was not an act of imagination. It was an accommodation to scale. As exchange stretched across regions and generations, material forms became less practical. Symbols carried value more efficiently. Yet even in this abstraction, the same human concerns remained. Trust had to be earned. Fear had to be managed. Continuity had to be maintained. Paper did not eliminate these concerns. It reorganized them. Value could now disappear without sound or weight. Loss became quieter. Confidence became more fragile. Systems depended even more on shared belief. But as long as records were honored, exchange continued. People adjusted. Life moved forward. Money, once again, had changed form without changing purpose. It continued to serve the same quiet function it always had: to allow effort to move through time, to allow trust to extend beyond memory, to coordinate human activity at a scale that direct relationships could no longer support. And so the story continued, not as a break from the past, but as another gradual step along the same path, shaped by necessity rather than intention, unfolding slowly as people learned, once again, how much abstraction they were willing to accept. As paper claims became familiar, they began to change how people thought about ownership. Before, ownership meant holding something, a tool in the hand, grain in storage, metal in a pouch. Possession was physical and visible. With paper claims, ownership became indirect. What mattered was not what you held, but what you were entitled to reclaim. This distinction took time to settle into everyday thinking. At first, people treated records cautiously. They verified them. They relied on known institutions. They preferred redemption over circulation. But as exchanges succeeded without interruption, confidence grew. Gradually, reclaiming the metal became unnecessary in most cases. The claim itself was enough. Value had become symbolic. This symbolism required discipline on both sides. Those who issued claims had to restrain themselves. Issuing more claims than metal held would break trust. Those who accepted claims had to believe restraint was being maintained. The system depended on balance that could not be seen directly. This invisible balance became a quiet source of tension. As long as everyday exchange functioned smoothly, few questioned it. Most people interacted only with the surface. A payment received. A payment made. Life continued. The deeper structure remained out of sight. Out of sight did not mean unimportant. When confidence was strong, abstraction felt natural. When confidence weakened, people sought reassurance. They wanted proof that promises were still anchored to something real. This desire for reassurance appeared repeatedly across history. Sometimes reassurance came through audits and inspections. Sometimes through reform. Sometimes through ritual displays of authority. These actions were not merely administrative. They were psychological. They restored belief. Belief mattered more than explanation. Few people needed to understand the full system. They needed only to believe that it would continue to function tomorrow as it had today. This expectation allowed planning. Planning allowed cooperation. Cooperation sustained complexity. Paper money extended this complexity further than metal ever could. Records could represent large amounts without physical strain. They could be divided easily. They could be stored compactly. They allowed long-distance trade to grow without proportional risk. These advantages reshaped commerce gradually but decisively. With growth came new roles. Intermediaries emerged. Institutions specialized in holding, transferring, and accounting for value. These entities did not create wealth directly. They managed trust. Their success depended not on force, but on reliability. Reliability became reputation. Reputation spread slowly at first, then more quickly as networks expanded. A trusted institution attracted deposits. Deposits increased influence. Influence demanded restraint. Failure punished swiftly, often beyond recovery. This dynamic encouraged conservatism. Systems that survived learned caution. They learned to value continuity over expansion, to prefer stability over novelty. This conservatism shaped monetary practice for long periods. Yet pressure to expand never disappeared. As populations grew and exchange intensified, demand for convenience increased. People wanted faster settlement, wider reach, and greater flexibility. Systems responded by refining abstraction further. Records became transferable. Claims became standardized. What once required personal acknowledgement became routine. At this stage, money no longer felt like a claim on metal. It felt complete in itself. Most people no longer imagined redemption. They accepted circulation as final. The idea that value rested elsewhere faded into background assumption. The system had become self-referential. This did not mean metal disappeared from importance. It meant it no longer needed to move. Money had become primarily an agreement, supported by material reserve, institutional practice, and collective habit. Its strength lay not in any single element, but in their alignment. Alignment was fragile but workable. When alignment held, money faded from awareness. It became infrastructure. When alignment strained, attention returned to foundations. This pattern repeated. Throughout these changes, human behavior adapted without formal instruction. People learned through experience, through success and failure, through stability and disruption. Money evolved alongside this learning. It remained a tool rather than a destination. Paper did not replace barter in spirit. It replaced weight in practice. It carried forward the same purpose that coins once served, which barter served before them: to allow exchange without constant negotiation, to allow trust to extend beyond immediate familiarity. Each step added distance. Each step required more belief. Each step reduced visibility. People accepted these costs because the benefits were tangible. Ease, rate, continuity. Money continued to move further from physical form, not because abstraction was preferred, but because daily life rewarded it. What worked endured. What failed was adjusted or abandoned. And so the system settled again, temporarily, into another familiar shape. Not permanent, not final, just familiar enough to support the next stretch of human cooperation, waiting quietly for the next pressure that would require it to change once more. As this familiarity settled in, money also began to change how people understood limits on creation. When value was metal, limits were visible. Mining took effort. Refining took time. Scarcity was anchored in the physical world. Growth was slow because it had to be. With paper claims and records, limits became less obvious. Value could be created by writing, by agreement, by authorization. What restrained creation was no longer nature alone, but judgment. Systems had to decide how much promise could safely exist at once. This decision was never simple. Too little circulation slowed exchange. Too much strained trust. Balance mattered, but balance was difficult to measure when the foundation was no longer visible. Institutions learned this gradually. They observed behavior rather than theory. When claims circulated smoothly, confidence held. When redemption increased suddenly, pressure appeared. Systems adjusted in response, often after strain was already felt. These adjustments were reactive, not predictive. Money systems rarely anticipate perfectly. They respond to what has already happened. This lag is part of their nature. Human behavior changes first. Structure follows. As paper-based systems expanded, people interacted less with the source of value and more with its representation. For most, money became something that arrived, moved, and disappeared without explanation. Understanding was unnecessary for use. This separation deepened abstraction. Money no longer needed to be trusted because it was understood. It was trusted because it was habitual. Habit replaced comprehension. Routine replaced curiosity. This worked well in stable periods. When exchange repeated without interruption, belief reinforced itself. People stopped thinking about why money worked and focused on what it allowed them to do. Plans extended. Commitments lengthened. Complexity grew. But abstraction carried a cost. When disruption appeared, it was harder to explain. People sensed instability without seeing cause. Anxiety rose without clear focus. Attention turned toward symbols, authority, and reassurance. In these moments, money's psychological role became visible. Statements, guarantees, and formal language were used to restore confidence, not because they added substance, but because they reinforced expectation. Expectation mattered more than explanation. People wanted continuity. As long as tomorrow resembled today closely enough, systems held. When resemblance weakened, behavior shifted. Exchange slowed. Claims shortened. Trust narrowed. These shifts were not coordinated. They emerged from individual decisions. Each person adjusted slightly. Together, these adjustments reshaped the system. Money reflected this collective movement. It tightened or loosened. It accumulated or circulated. It revealed changes in confidence through patterns rather than proclamations. Observers often mistook these patterns for causes rather than effects. Money was blamed or praised when it was largely responding. This misunderstanding persisted across eras. Money appeared powerful because it was everywhere. In reality, it was sensitive. It responded to human behavior continuously. It amplified tendencies rather than originating them. Understanding this sensitivity explains its endurance. A rigid system would fracture. A responsive one adapts. Money adapts because it is embedded in use rather than imposed from above. Even when authority played a role, acceptance remained essential. Without acceptance, symbols lost meaning. Records lost force. Exchange stalled. Acceptance could not be commanded indefinitely. It had to be earned through consistency. Consistency built slowly, through honoring claims, through settling obligations, through maintaining routines. These ordinary actions mattered more than grand declarations. As long as they continued, belief persisted. Over long spans of time, people came to live within layers of money without noticing them. Metal, paper, record, promise. Each layer rested on the one beneath it. Most interaction occurred at the surface. Surface interaction was enough. Only during stress did deeper layers come into view. People remembered that money was constructed, not given, that it relied on alignment rather than inevitability. After stress passed, forgetting returned. Forgetting was functional. It allowed attention to move elsewhere, to family, work, and survival. Money returned to background. This cycle of attention and neglect shaped its evolution. Systems that demanded constant attention failed. Systems that tolerated neglect endured. Money learned to be unobtrusive. From barter to coins, from coins to paper, from paper to layered records, each step reduced friction and increased reliance on trust. Each step asked people to accept more abstraction in exchange for convenience. Acceptance was rarely enthusiastic. It was practical. People accepted what worked. And so the system moved forward again, not through vision, but through accommodation. Adjusting quietly, responding to pressure, absorbing behavior, and continuing to serve its central purpose. To allow coordination among people separated by time, distance, and limited knowledge. That purpose remained unchanged, even as the forms carrying it became lighter, less visible, and more dependent on shared belief. The story continued, as it always had, without announcement, carried forward by ordinary use, shaped by necessity, and open to whatever adjustments the next period of strain would require. As these layered systems settled, money also began to shape how people understood authority. In earlier exchange, authority was immediate. It lived in elders, leaders, or shared custom. Disputes were resolved through presence. Enforcement depended on proximity and reputation. With abstract money, authority moved outward. It became embedded in institutions rather than individuals. Trust no longer rested on who someone was, but on what role they occupied. A signature mattered more than a face. A seal mattered more than a voice. This shift reduced personal friction. People did not need to assess character constantly. They relied on structure. Structure promised consistency. Consistency reduced uncertainty. Yet structure also required distance. Decisions were made far from those affected by them. Rules were applied broadly rather than contextually. Authority became less flexible but more predictable. Predictability mattered. In large systems, predictability allows planning. People can adapt to rules they disagree with more easily than to rules that change without warning. Money systems learned this lesson repeatedly. Stability became a priority. As authority centralized, money became one of its primary tools. Not because money created authority, but because authority needed a way to coordinate action across scale. Money provided that coordination quietly. Taxes, payments, and funding all relied on shared belief in the system. Without belief, authority weakened. With belief, it endured. This mutual dependence shaped both sides. Authority learned restraint, knowing that overreach could erode trust. Money systems learned alignment, knowing that authority lent credibility. Neither could function fully without the other. This balance was never perfect. Sometimes authority strained systems. Sometimes systems constrained authority. Adjustment followed imbalance. Through reform, through resistance, through gradual change, money reflected these tensions without resolving them. It carried authority where authority was accepted. It retreated where acceptance thinned. It did not command belief. It mirrored it. For most people, these dynamics remained invisible. Daily interaction with money was simple. Earned, spend, save. Obligation and permission operated in the background. Authority was felt only when rules were enforced or boundaries crossed. This invisibility was intentional. A system that constantly asserts itself invites scrutiny. A system that fades into routine invites acceptance. Money learned to be quiet. Quiet systems endure. They do not provoke unless strained. They do not demand allegiance. They assume it. This assumption works only as long as experience supports it. When experience diverges, attention returns. Questions arise. Authority is tested. After testing, systems either adjust or fracture. Money survives because it adjusts. It bends toward prevailing behavior. It incorporates new norms. It absorbs pressure through modification rather than collapse most of the time. This adaptability is slow. Change appears incremental within a lifetime. Only across generations does transformation become clear. Each generation inherits a system already adjusted by the last. Few see the full arc. They see only the present form and assume it is natural. They build lives within it. They make plans that depend on its continuity. This dependence reinforces the system further. Money becomes not just a tool, but an environment. An environment shapes behavior subtly. It encourages certain actions, discourages others. It does not instruct directly. It influences through repetition and constraint. People learn what is possible by observing what works. Over time, money teaches restraint as much as ambition. It signals limits even as it extends reach. It reminds people, quietly, that coordination requires compromise. This lesson is not spoken. It is lived through small decisions made daily, through habits formed unconsciously, through routines that feel normal because they are shared. Money carries these routines forward. It preserves patterns of behavior long after their origin is forgotten. It encodes social agreements into practice. It turns expectation into structure. From barter to coins, from coins to paper, from paper to layered systems supported by authority, the movement has been steady. Each step answered a need. Each step introduced new distance. Each step required renewed trust. And at each stage, people adjusted not because they fully understood the system, but because life continued and exchange was necessary. This necessity remains. As long as people must coordinate beyond familiarity, as long as effort must travel farther than memory, as long as trust must be extended beyond direct knowledge, some form of money will persist. Not as a final invention, not as a fixed structure, but as an evolving accommodation, shaped by authority and acceptance, stability and strain, habit and adjustment, moving forward slowly, carried by ordinary actions that together sustain the long and quiet continuity of human exchange. As this environment deepened, money also shaped how people understood obligation to systems rather than to individuals. Earlier, obligation was personal. You owed someone because you knew them, because they helped you, because your lives were intertwined. Obligation carried emotion. Gratitude and resentment lived close together. With abstract money and institutional authority, obligation became impersonal. You owed because a rule existed, because a record showed it, because a system expected continuity. The reason mattered less than the requirement. This reduced conflict in many cases. It also reduced connection. People learned to separate duty from feeling. This separation allowed large populations to function without constant negotiation. Most obligations could be settled without conversation. Payment closed the matter. The system moved on. Efficiency increased. But something else happened quietly. When obligation becomes impersonal, responsibility can feel lighter. A person fulfills a requirement and feels finished, even if the broader effect is unclear. Moral weight shifts away from individual judgment toward procedural completion. This shift is subtle but persistent. It changes how people think about fairness. A rule followed feels just, even when outcomes differ widely. The system becomes the reference point rather than lived experience. Money reinforces this reference point by translating obligation into quantity. Once quantified, obligation feels complete when the number is satisfied. No further reflection seems required. Yet human experience rarely fits neatly into numbers. This mismatch creates tension that never fully disappears. Societies respond by creating parallel languages of responsibility. Ethics, customs, and informal expectations continue alongside formal systems. Money does not replace these languages. It narrows its own role. Over time, people learn where money applies and where it does not. They learn which obligations can be settled through exchange and which require presence, care, or acknowledgement. These boundaries are not fixed. They shift across cultures and eras. They are tested repeatedly. Some expand, some retract. Money adapts to these shifts by remaining incomplete. It handles coordination well. It handles meaning poorly. This limitation protects it. If money attempted to define everything, it would fracture under contradiction. By remaining partial, it remains usable. As obligations became system-based, people also learned to navigate anonymity. They interacted daily with others they would never meet again. Exchange occurred without relationship. Trust rested on expectation rather than familiarity. This anonymity reduced risk in some ways. Personal conflict mattered less. Reputation traveled through institutions rather than gossip. Identity became less central to exchange. At the same time, anonymity reduced accountability felt at a human level. When outcomes were harmful, responsibility felt distant. No single person appeared at fault. Systems absorbed blame as they absorbed action. People adapted to this by narrowing their sense of control. They focused on what they could manage: their role, their obligation, their immediate exchange. Money supported this narrowing by providing clear endpoints: payment made, obligation fulfilled, attention released. This release allowed people to function within complexity without being overwhelmed by it. Complexity demands limits on concern. No one can hold the full weight of a large system in mind. Money allows participation without total comprehension. It reduces cognitive load by simplifying interaction. This simplification is not deception. It is necessity. Without it, large-scale cooperation would collapse under the strain of constant moral calculation. People would hesitate endlessly, unable to act. Money allows action to proceed. Action sustains life. This is why money persists even when criticized. Criticism addresses its limits. Use acknowledges its function. Both can coexist. Over long periods, societies learn to live within this coexistence. They accept that money cannot resolve all questions. They rely on it where it works and supplement it where it does not. This pragmatic acceptance defines its endurance. Money was never meant to explain the world. It was meant to coordinate it. From the first exchanges to the layered systems that followed, this purpose remained steady. The forms changed. The scale expanded. The distance increased. But the underlying accommodation stayed the same. People needed a way to cooperate beyond familiarity, beyond memory, beyond immediate presence. They built tools to do so. Those tools evolved as needs evolved. Money remains one of those tools. It continues to shape behavior quietly, guiding obligation, enabling anonymity, simplifying action, and allowing complex systems to function without demanding constant attention. It does not solve human limitation. It works around it. And so the story continues, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a steady extension of patterns set long ago, carried forward by ordinary participation, adjusted by experience, and sustained by the ongoing decision to keep using a system that, while imperfect, remains sufficient for the task it was shaped to perform. As this system of impersonal obligation matured, money also began to influence how people understood trust itself. Earlier, trust was earned slowly. It grew through repeated interaction, shared experience, and visible reliability. To trust someone was to know them, or to know those who knew them. Trust lived in proximity. With money, trust became transferable. A person did not need to trust another individual directly. They needed to trust the system that connected them. The system stood between strangers, absorbing uncertainty and presenting predictability in its place. This was not blind trust. It was conditional. People trusted the system because it worked often enough, because obligations were usually honored, because disruption, when it occurred, was followed by adjustment. Trust became statistical rather than personal. Most days it did not feel like trust at all. It felt like routine. Routine is powerful. When something functions repeatedly without incident, attention fades. Doubt softens. The system becomes part of the environment. Money reached this state gradually, through countless ordinary exchanges that ended without conflict. Conflict did not disappear. It became managed. Disputes moved into formal channels. Resolution followed procedure. Emotion was displaced by process. This displacement reduced volatility. It also reduced immediacy. People learned to wait for outcomes rather than demand them. Waiting became structured. Timelines were set. Deadlines defined. Delays tolerated within bounds. Money systems taught patience by normalizing delay. Payment did not always mean instant settlement. Obligation unfolded over time. This temporal structure changed expectations. People began to live within schedules rather than moments. The future became something to coordinate rather than endure. Money provided reference points that made this coordination possible. Yet trust in the future was never absolute. It was renewed continuously through experience. When experience aligned with expectation, confidence returned quietly. When it did not, people adjusted behavior. They shortened horizons. They narrowed trust. These adjustments were subtle. Rarely did people abandon systems entirely. They modified participation. They became cautious. They favored immediacy. They reduced exposure. Money reflected these shifts through slower circulation and altered patterns. Observers often noticed only the outcomes, not the cause. They spoke of confidence or fear as if these were abstract forces. In reality, they were accumulations of individual decisions made in response to lived experience. Money translated these decisions into structure. It recorded behavior without judging it. It amplified trends without creating them. It became a mirror held up to collective action. This mirroring explains why money feels powerful. It reflects what many people are doing at once. That reflection can appear to drive outcomes when it is in fact responding to them. Understanding this distinction takes distance. Distance reveals that money does not lead. It follows. It follows trust. It follows caution. It follows habit. These human elements move first. Money rearranges itself around them. Over long periods, this responsiveness allowed money systems to survive changes that rigid structures could not. They bent under pressure rather than breaking. They absorbed behavior rather than resisting it. This adaptability was learned. Early systems failed often. Overissuance, misalignment, and loss of trust occurred repeatedly. Each failure left traces. Rules were refined. Practices adjusted. Memory accumulated. Money carried this memory forward. It encoded past lessons into present behavior. Not consciously but structurally. Limits appeared where excess had caused harm. Flexibility emerged where rigidity had failed. These adjustments were not perfect. They lagged behind change. They favored continuity over innovation. They reflected the past more than they anticipated the future. But they were enough to sustain cooperation. Enough is important. A system does not need to be optimal to endure. It needs to be workable. Money achieved workability through compromise rather than design. It accepted imperfection in exchange for persistence. As trust shifted from individuals to systems, people learned to navigate layered responsibility. They trusted institutions to handle what they could not oversee. They reserved personal trust for what remained close. This division reduced strain. No one can carry the full weight of a large system emotionally. Money allows partial participation. It limits the scope of concern to what is manageable. This limitation is not indifference. It is survival. Large societies depend on it. Without such boundaries, cooperation would dissolve under moral overload. People would hesitate endlessly, unsure of consequences. Money simplifies action by narrowing focus. Action sustains continuity. And so trust, once rooted in proximity, expanded outward through system and symbol. It became less intimate but more scalable, less emotional but more durable. Money played a central role in this expansion, not by commanding belief, but by providing a framework where belief could be minimal and still sufficient. This sufficiency is its quiet achievement. It does not require certainty. It tolerates doubt. It continues to function as long as doubt does not overwhelm use. Use remains the foundation. As long as people continue to exchange, to accept, to honor obligations most of the time, money persists. It adapts to changing patterns of trust without needing to redefine itself explicitly. The story does not hinge on invention or collapse. It unfolds through adjustment, through trust shifting slightly, through behavior changing gradually, through systems responding slowly. Money moves within this rhythm, never entirely separate from human experience, never fully identical to it, but always shaped by the same underlying need: to cooperate without knowing, to act without certainty, to trust just enough to move forward. And in that role, it continues quietly, embedded in routine, carrying forward the accumulated habits of countless exchanges, waiting for the next subtle shift that will ask it to change once again. As this pattern of conditional trust continued, money also shaped how people understood permanence. In early life, permanence was rare. Structures decayed, tools wore out, memory faded. Most things required renewal. Stability existed, but only within short spans of time. Continuity depended on constant effort. Money introduced a different sense of endurance. Value could now persist without constant renewal of the object itself. A claim could last longer than the material that first inspired it. A record could survive generations. This endurance created the feeling that some things could outlast individual lives. This feeling changed behavior. People began to act with longer horizons. They considered futures they would not personally experience. They made arrangements for others. Inheritance, stewardship, and legacy gained clarity because money allowed value to be passed forward without transformation. Yet this permanence was conditional. It depended on systems continuing to function, on records being honored, on institutions surviving disruption. Permanence existed not as certainty, but as expectation reinforced by habit. Expectation was enough. Most people did not require proof that systems would endure forever. They required only that they endure long enough to justify present action. Money made this justification plausible. This plausibility supported long-term cooperation. Projects could extend across years. Agreements could span decades. Responsibility could be shared across time. Money provided the connective tissue that made such arrangements workable. At the same time, this endurance introduced new vulnerabilities. When value persists beyond immediate context, errors persist as well. Misjudgments can echo forward. Decisions made under one set of assumptions can shape outcomes long after those assumptions have changed. Money carries history with it, not as narrative but as structure. Old rules influence new behavior. Past constraints shape present options. Continuity brings stability, but also inertia. Societies learned to manage this inertia cautiously. They created mechanisms for revision. Laws could be amended. Records could be updated. Systems could be restructured. These changes were rarely swift. They required consensus, effort, and time. Money adapted slowly alongside these processes. It retained familiar forms while absorbing new rules. It preserved continuity while allowing gradual adjustment. This balance prevented rupture, but it also slowed correction. Slowness was accepted. Rapid change threatened trust. Gradual change preserved it. Money systems favored the latter, even at the cost of delay. This preference shaped how people understood reform. Change was expected to be incremental. Abrupt shifts provoked fear. Gradual shifts allowed adaptation. Money reflected this preference by evolving through layering rather than replacement. Old forms remained visible beneath new ones. Coins circulated alongside paper. Paper alongside records. Records alongside promises. Each layer rested on the one before it. Most people interacted with only one layer, unaware of the rest. This layering created resilience. If one layer strained, others absorbed pressure. The system did not rely on a single point of trust. It distributed reliance across practices, institutions, and habits. Distribution reduced fragility. It also increased complexity. Few could see the whole. Understanding became specialized. Most participation became routine rather than informed. This division was practical. Large systems cannot require full comprehension from everyone. They rely on partial knowledge and shared assumption. Money enabled this by standardizing interaction. Standardization did not erase difference. It allowed difference to coexist. People with different beliefs, customs, and priorities could exchange without agreement on meaning. Money provided a narrow interface where cooperation was possible without consensus. This interface expanded human coordination beyond cultural boundaries. It also reduced the need for mutual understanding. Exchange could occur without conversation. Relationship became optional. This optionality shaped social life. Some connections weakened. Others strengthened in different ways. People chose where to invest attention. Money handled what did not require intimacy. Life adjusted around this division. Over long periods, this adjustment became normalized. Money ceased to feel like a choice. It became an assumption, an underlying condition of interaction. People planned within it rather than around it. Only when assumptions were challenged did reflection return. These moments of reflection were often uncomfortable. They disrupted routine. They exposed dependency. But they also reminded societies that money was constructed, not inevitable. After reflection, routine usually resumed. The cost of abandoning structured exchange was too high. Coordination would collapse. Effort would fragment. Life would narrow. Money returned, perhaps altered, but recognizable. This return was not nostalgia. It was necessity. The same necessity that gave rise to barter. That shaped coins. That allowed records to replace metal. That carried trust outward from proximity to system. This necessity remains. People continue to live with limited memory, limited foresight, and limited trust. They continue to need tools that allow cooperation despite these limits. Money remains one of those tools. It does not promise permanence. It offers continuity. It does not guarantee stability. It provides a framework for it. It does not remove uncertainty. It allows planning within it. These modest contributions are enough to sustain long-term social life. And so the story moves forward again, not with finality, but with persistence. Money continues to adapt quietly, carrying forward accumulated habits, absorbing new pressures, and adjusting slowly to the changing contours of human cooperation. It remains present not because it solves everything, but because it continues to solve just enough, allowing people to act, to plan, and to trust enough to keep moving forward through time. As this sense of continuity took hold, money also began to influence how people related to uncertainty. In earlier life, uncertainty was immediate and visible. Weather changed. Crops failed. Illness arrived without warning. Responses were direct and local. People adapted by staying close to what they could see and control. Money did not remove uncertainty. It reorganized it. Instead of uncertainty being tied only to nature or chance, it became distributed across systems. Outcomes depended not just on weather or health, but on arrangements, promises, and coordination. Risk moved from the visible world into shared structures. This shift required a different kind of acceptance. People learned that not everything affecting their lives would be understandable in the moment. Some causes would be distant, some effects delayed. Money made this tolerable by offering predictability in exchange, even when the broader picture remained unclear. Predictability reduced fear. If a payment was expected, it usually arrived. If an obligation was recorded, it was usually honored. These small regularities created a sense of order that counterbalanced uncertainty elsewhere. Order mattered more than certainty. Money systems did not promise outcomes. They promised procedure. When procedures held, people felt grounded enough to continue. This grounding supported patience. People accepted waiting when they trusted the process. They tolerated delay when they believed it served continuity. Money systems taught this patience by embedding time into obligation. Deadlines, terms, and intervals became normal. Time became structured. Structured time allowed planning beyond immediacy. People could imagine sequences rather than moments. They could coordinate effort across stages. Money provided the reference points that made this sequencing possible. Yet uncertainty never disappeared. It lingered beneath routine. It surfaced during disruption. It reminded people that systems were human-made and therefore imperfect. Money absorbed this reminder by adjusting behavior rather than denying it. When uncertainty rose, people became cautious. They shortened commitments. They favored liquidity. They reduced exposure. These reactions were not panicked. They were adaptive. Money reflected them automatically. Circulation slowed. Patterns changed. Systems responded gradually. This responsiveness prevented many disruptions from becoming terminal. Terminal failure was rare. More common were periods of strain followed by adjustment. Money systems learned to survive by bending rather than resisting. They allowed uncertainty to pass through rather than attempting to eliminate it. Elimination was impossible. Uncertainty is part of human life. Money's role was to make it manageable enough to live with. This management shaped emotional life quietly. People learned to live with partial knowledge, to act without full certainty, to trust procedures rather than understanding every cause. Money normalized this posture. Normalization reduced anxiety. Not completely, but enough. Enough to allow daily life to continue without constant fear. Enough to allow long-term projects to exist. Enough to allow cooperation among people who would never share the same information. This quiet emotional regulation is often overlooked. Money is rarely discussed in terms of feeling, yet it influences feeling continuously. Confidence, caution, hope, restraint. These states shape behavior long before they are articulated. Money systems respond to these states because they are embedded in use. They record behavior indirectly. They reflect mood without naming it. Over time, this reflection creates feedback. When people feel secure, they act expansively. When they feel uncertain, they contract. Money mirrors these shifts and amplifies them through structure. This amplification can appear dramatic in retrospect. In the moment, it feels incremental. Each person adjusts slightly. Together, these adjustments reshape the environment. Money does not cause this reshaping. It carries it. Understanding this helps explain why money persists despite repeated strain. It does not require ideal conditions. It adapts to prevailing ones. It absorbs human uncertainty rather than denying it. This absorption is not smooth. There are moments of friction, periods of discomfort, times when systems lag behind behavior. But over long spans, adjustment continues. From barter to coins, from coins to records, from records to layered systems, money has continuously adapted to how people manage uncertainty. Each form reflects the balance between what can be known and what must be assumed. As long as people live with uncertainty, they will seek structures that make it tolerable. Money remains one such structure. It does not resolve the unknown. It provides a framework within which action remains possible. That possibility sustains cooperation. Cooperation sustains society. And so money continues quietly, embedded in routine, adjusting to shifting moods, carrying forward shared assumptions, and allowing people to act with enough confidence to continue, even when the future remains only partially visible. The story moves forward in this way, not toward certainty, but toward continuity, shaped by how people live with what they cannot fully control, and how they choose to keep exchanging, planning, and trusting just enough to move through time together. As this way of living with uncertainty became familiar, money also shaped how people understood choice. In earlier forms of exchange, choice was limited by proximity and necessity. You traded with those nearby. You accepted what was available. Options were constrained by circumstance more than preference. Money expanded the field of choice. Because value could be carried and transferred, people were no longer bound to a single source or path. They could select among alternatives. They could compare. They could defer decisions. Choice became an ordinary part of life rather than an exception. This expansion felt empowering, yet it also introduced responsibility of a new kind. When options multiply, outcomes feel more personal. Success and failure appear linked to decision rather than fate. Money made this linkage visible by attaching numbers to outcomes. Numbers clarify, but they also simplify. They suggest precision where life remains complex. A decision can appear correct on paper and still feel wrong in experience. Money does not resolve this tension. It frames it. People learned to live within that frame. They used money to navigate options, knowing it could not capture everything that mattered. Over time, judgment adapted. Some choices were guided by calculation, others by habit, intuition, or values that resisted measurement. This division became normal. Money handled comparison. People handled meaning. As systems matured, this separation reduced strain. Not everything required deep reflection. Many decisions could be settled quickly. Efficiency returned time and attention to other areas of life. This efficiency was cumulative. Small reductions in friction, repeated daily, reshaped routines. Life felt faster, but also more structured. Days became organized around transactions and obligations. Money marked transitions between effort and rest. Time itself felt different. Earlier, time flowed with natural rhythms. Seasons dominated. With money, time became segmented. Hours, days, and cycles gained economic meaning. Effort was timed. Reward followed schedules. This segmentation supported coordination. Large groups could align activity. Projects could be synchronized. Deadlines could be shared. Money provided the reference that made this alignment workable. But segmentation also compressed experience. When time is measured closely, pressure increases. People become aware of passing moments. Delay feels costly. Waiting becomes something to manage rather than endure. Money did not invent this awareness. It sharpened it. Societies adapted by creating spaces where time could loosen again. Rituals rest and custom balance structure. These practices existed alongside money, not against it. Balance was necessary. Without release, structure would exhaust. Without structure, coordination would collapse. Money operated within this balance, supporting order while leaving room for life beyond calculation. Over long periods, people learned to move between these modes. They calculated when needed. They let go when possible. Money facilitated the transition by being present but not all-consuming. Its presence was strongest in exchange, weakest in meaning. This limitation protected social life. Money did not claim to explain purpose. It handled logistics. It allowed people to cooperate materially while remaining free to interpret life personally. This separation made diversity possible. Different beliefs, values, and traditions could coexist within the same exchange system. Money did not require agreement on meaning, only agreement on use. Use became the common ground. As long as use continued, difference could remain. Conflict was reduced not by consensus, but by coordination. Money made this coordination routine. Routine reduced tension. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to allow plural societies to function. Enough to allow people to pursue different paths without constant negotiation. Enough to sustain complexity over time. This sustaining role explains money's persistence. It does not demand shared vision. It tolerates divergence. It provides a narrow interface where cooperation can occur without deeper alignment. That interface is modest but powerful. It allows exchange without intimacy, planning without certainty, action without full agreement. These allowances carry costs. Distance, abstraction, impersonality. Societies continually weigh these costs against benefits. They accept them because the alternative is fragmentation. Fragmentation limits reach. It confines effort. It narrows possibility. Money extends possibility. Not infinitely, not safely, but enough to matter. And so the system continues, shaped by how people choose among options, manage time, and balance calculation with meaning. Money remains part of this shaping, neither dominant nor absent, but quietly present wherever coordination is needed. It moves with human behavior, adjusting to how people live, decide, and relate to uncertainty, carrying forward the accumulated accommodations of the past, and remaining open to the next subtle shift that will ask it to change again. As these patterns of choice and coordination settled into everyday life, money also began to influence how people understood responsibility for the future. In earlier times, the future was close. Planning rarely extended beyond seasons or immediate survival. Responsibility focused on what could be seen and reached. Long horizons belonged mostly to myth and tradition. Money stretched those horizons. Because value could be carried forward, people began to act with a sense of obligation toward outcomes they would not personally witness. They saved not only for need, but for continuity. They arranged transfers not only for themselves, but for others. The future became something that could be prepared for, not merely awaited. This preparation was practical rather than philosophical. Most people did not think in abstract terms about legacy. They responded to patterns. They noticed that continuity reduced vulnerability. They observed that preparation softened uncertainty. Money made such preparation manageable. Yet responsibility for the future was never evenly shared. Some had the capacity to extend their horizon. Others lived closer to immediacy. Money did not erase this difference. It formalized it. The ability to plan became visible and persistent. Societies responded unevenly. Customs emerged to soften disparity. Traditions of support, inheritance rules, and shared obligations developed alongside money. These practices acknowledged that coordination alone could not ensure fairness. Money organized effort. Culture attempted to organize meaning. Neither fully succeeded alone. Over time, people learned to live within this partial success. They accepted that no system could account for every circumstance. They relied on money where it worked and on human judgment where it did not. This reliance was pragmatic. Pragmatism shaped the evolution of money more than theory ever did. Systems survived not because they were elegant, but because they were workable. They adapted to behavior rather than demanding it change. As generations passed, people came to see money less as an object or record and more as an expectation. Something that would be there tomorrow because it was there today. Something that could be relied upon without being examined. This expectation carried comfort. Comfort reduced friction. Reduced friction allowed complexity. Complexity allowed expansion. The cycle reinforced itself quietly, but comfort also invited complacency. When systems feel stable, attention drifts. Oversight relaxes. Assumptions harden. Money does not prevent this. It reflects it. Stability and fragility grow together. History shows that renewal often follows complacency, not as punishment but as adjustment. When alignment weakens, pressure returns attention to foundations. People reassess. Systems respond. Balance shifts. Money absorbs this process rather than directing it. It does not insist on awareness. It tolerates neglect. It continues to function until neglect reaches a limit. Then it forces attention indirectly through behavior. This indirectness is important. Money rarely announces change. It reveals it through altered patterns, through hesitation, through acceleration, through silence where activity once was. People notice these signals before they understand them. Understanding follows experience, not the other way around. This lag shapes how societies learn. They respond to what feels different. They articulate reasons later. Money participates by translating feeling into structure. Over long spans, this translation produces gradual evolution. The path from barter to coins was one such translation. The path from coins to records another. Each reflected how people learned to manage coordination, trust, distance, and time. There was no final form. There was only what worked well enough under current conditions. As conditions changed, forms adjusted. This adjustment continues. Money remains unfinished because human cooperation remains unfinished. Needs shift. Scales change. Understanding evolves. Money follows. It remains a tool shaped by use rather than doctrine, a medium shaped by behavior rather than design. This is why its history feels continuous rather than episodic. Changes blend into routine. New forms feel normal quickly. Old forms linger in memory longer than in use. The system moves forward without declaring itself new. People live within it. They plan. They exchange. They trust enough to act. They do not need money to be perfect. They need it to be present, predictable enough, and flexible enough to absorb change. So it continues, quietly accompanying human effort, reflecting collective behavior, adjusting to new pressures, and carrying forward the accumulated accommodations of countless lives. Not toward resolution, not toward certainty, but forward patiently, shaped by ordinary decisions repeated day after day, sustaining cooperation in a world where trust must always extend a little beyond what can be seen, known, or fully controlled. As this sense of future responsibility settled into habit, money also shaped how people understood risk. In early life, risk was immediate and personal. A poor decision showed its consequences quickly. A journey failed or succeeded. A harvest endured or did not. Risk was felt in the body and resolved in the moment. Money stretched risk across time. An action taken today might not reveal its outcome for years. A promise could travel far before returning. Risk became distributed, delayed, and shared among many participants. Its presence was less visible, but no less real. This changed how people behaved. Instead of avoiding risk entirely, people learned to manage it. They accepted uncertainty as part of exchange. They relied on patterns rather than certainty. Money allowed this reliance by smoothing outcomes across many transactions. One failure did not always mean collapse. Loss could be absorbed. Plans could be adjusted. Effort could be redirected. This flexibility made risk tolerable. It encouraged participation in larger systems that no single person could fully control. Tolerance is different from comfort. People did not become indifferent to risk. They became accustomed to living alongside it. Money normalized this coexistence by making outcomes less abrupt. Not painless, but less final. As systems matured, risk became something to account for rather than avoid. Records tracked exposure. Terms reflected uncertainty. Time itself became part of calculation. None of this eliminated risk. It organized it. Organization reduced fear. When risk is named and structured, it feels manageable. When it is sudden and unexplained, it feels overwhelming. Money helped convert unknown danger into known possibility. This conversion shaped institutions. Structures emerged to hold risk collectively, not because individuals desired abstraction, but because shared exposure reduced individual vulnerability. Money provided the language and mechanism for this sharing. Yet shared risk also diluted awareness. When responsibility spreads, attention thins. People sense protection without seeing its source. They participate without fully understanding how outcomes are shaped. This participation is necessary for scale, but it carries consequences. Distance returns. Risk feels distant until it is not. Adjustment follows reaction. Systems respond after behavior shifts. This delay is not failure. It is characteristic of complexity. Money reflects this complexity faithfully. It does not warn in advance. It signals change through behavior, through slowing, through tightening, through silence. These signals are subtle but persistent. Those who watch closely notice patterns. Most do not need to. Most live within routine. Routine allows life to continue without constant vigilance. Money supports this by absorbing small fluctuations without demanding attention. Only larger imbalances break routine. When they do, people reassess risk. They narrow participation. They shorten horizons. They favor what feels stable. Money responds by contracting gently rather than collapsing abruptly. This gentleness preserves continuity. Across history, systems that survived learned to soften failure rather than eliminate it. Money evolved to serve this function. It became a buffer between decision and consequence. Buffers do not prevent impact. They distribute it. Distribution allows recovery. Recovery allows persistence. This persistence is the quiet success of money systems. Not that they avoid difficulty, but that they allow societies to pass through difficulty without losing the ability to coordinate. Coordination is fragile. It depends on trust, habit, and expectation. Risk threatens all three. Money mitigates this threat by structuring uncertainty rather than denying it. As long as uncertainty remains part of human life, this function remains necessary. People will continue to act without full knowledge. They will continue to make choices whose outcomes extend beyond immediate understanding. They will continue to seek ways to share exposure and reduce isolation. Money remains one of the tools that makes this possible. It does not remove responsibility. It redistributes it. It does not eliminate risk. It reframes it. It does not guarantee safety. It allows participation despite uncertainty. These allowances are subtle but essential. They have shaped human cooperation over long spans of time, allowing societies to grow larger, more complex, and more interdependent than personal trust alone would permit. And so money continues, not as a solution to risk, but as a companion to it, moving alongside human decision-making, adjusting quietly as behavior shifts, carrying forward accumulated experience, and remaining open to further change as new forms of uncertainty emerge. The movement remains unhurried. Risk appears. Behavior adapts. Systems respond. Money follows this sequence, embedded in use, shaped by necessity, and sustained by the ongoing willingness of people to act together despite not knowing everything that lies ahead. As people grew accustomed to living with shared risk, money also began to shape how they understood responsibility toward one another. In smaller settings, responsibility was direct. If someone struggled, the cause was usually known. Help followed familiarity. Support came from those who could see the need and felt connected to it. Obligation was personal and immediate. With larger systems, responsibility became indirect. People contributed to structures that supported others they would never meet. Assistance moved through institutions rather than hands. Money carried effort from one place to another without revealing the faces involved. Support became organized rather than spontaneous. This organization made help scalable. Many could contribute small amounts without knowing the recipient. Many could receive support without depending on a single relationship. Money allowed this diffusion of care, even though it stripped away personal connection. This trade was accepted gradually. People learned that direct support could not reach everyone. Systems filled gaps that proximity could not. Money enabled those systems to function by coordinating contributions across distance and time. Yet something changed quietly. When responsibility becomes system-based, feeling weakens. Obligation feels fulfilled when payment is made. Concern narrows to compliance. Compassion shifts away from individual judgment toward procedural completion. This shift did not remove empathy. It relocated it. People reserved emotional response for those close to them. Systems handled the rest. This division protected individuals from overload. No one could hold responsibility for everyone. Money made this boundary workable. By translating contribution into quantity, it allowed people to participate without constant emotional engagement. This detachment was not indifference. It was survival within complexity. Large societies require it. Without such boundaries, cooperation would collapse under emotional weight. Money provided a way to care at scale without demanding intimacy at scale. This solution was imperfect. Some needs resisted abstraction. Some situations required presence rather than payment. Societies responded by maintaining parallel forms of care. Family, community, and custom continued alongside formal systems. Money did not replace these forms. It relieved pressure on them. Over time, people learned which problems money could address and which it could not. This knowledge was rarely explicit. It emerged through experience, through frustration, through adjustment. Money adapted to these boundaries by remaining partial. It handled coordination well. It handled meaning poorly. This limitation prevented it from overwhelming social life. It left space for judgment, ritual, and care that could not be quantified. As systems matured, people navigated between personal and impersonal responsibility with increasing ease. They paid obligations without resentment. They offered help where it mattered personally. They learned to separate roles. This separation stabilized behavior. Expectations became clearer. Conflicts reduced. Life became manageable at scale. Money contributed by making some responsibilities predictable and others optional. Predictability reduces strain. When people know what is required, they can plan around it. Uncertainty narrows. Anxiety softens. Money provided clear endpoints to many obligations, allowing attention to return elsewhere. Yet predictability also invited complacency. When obligations feel routine, reflection fades. Systems operate on momentum rather than awareness. Money does not prevent this. It reflects it. Periodically, reflection returns, not through theory but through experience. When outcomes feel misaligned, people pause. They question arrangements. They reassess roles. Money registers this pause through changed behavior. Change follows slowly. This rhythm of routine and reflection repeats across history. Money moves within it, neither driving nor resisting it, but adjusting as needed. From early barter to coins, from coins to records, from records to layered systems, money has continually reshaped how people share responsibility beyond immediate connection. Each step extended reach. Each step reduced intimacy. Each step required new forms of trust. People accepted these changes not because they were ideal, but because they were workable. They allowed cooperation to continue as societies grew larger and more complex than personal relationships alone could support. That need remains. People still live with limits of attention, emotion, and knowledge. They still need ways to share effort and responsibility without becoming overwhelmed. Money remains one of those ways. It does not replace human care. It creates space for it by handling what can be standardized, leaving what cannot to personal judgment. This division is never final. Boundaries shift. Expectations change. Systems adapt. Money follows these movements quietly, embedded in routine, shaped by behavior, and sustained by use rather than belief. As long as people continue to live together beyond familiarity, to share burdens beyond sight, and to cooperate without knowing every consequence, money in some form will continue to accompany them. Not as a moral guide, not as a measure of worth, but as a practical tool that allows responsibility to be distributed, action to continue, and complex social life to persist without demanding more from individuals than they can reasonably carry. And so the movement goes on, steady and unannounced, carried forward by ordinary exchanges, quiet adjustments, and the ongoing effort to live together within the limits of human attention, trust, and care. As this shared sense of responsibility settled into routine, money also began to influence how people understood fairness over time. In earlier settings, fairness was negotiated face to face. Circumstances were visible. A poor harvest, an illness, or a loss could soften expectations. Judgment was immediate and flexible. Fairness was shaped by context as much as by outcome. With money-based systems, fairness became standardized. Rules replaced discretion. Amounts replaced circumstance. A payment fulfilled an obligation regardless of how difficult it had been to make. This standardization allowed large systems to function without constant negotiation. It also narrowed the meaning of fairness. Fairness became procedural. If the rule was followed, the outcome was considered acceptable. Whether it felt just was secondary. This distinction allowed coordination at scale, but it also created quiet dissatisfaction that never fully disappeared. People learned to live with this tension. They accepted that systems could be fair without being kind, and kind without being fair. Money operated firmly in the first category. Kindness remained elsewhere. This separation stabilized expectations. People knew what was required of them. They could predict outcomes. They could plan accordingly. Money provided clarity, even when it could not provide comfort. Clarity reduced conflict. Disputes shifted from personal argument to procedural appeal. Instead of asking whether an outcome felt right, people asked whether it followed the rule. This shift reduced emotional escalation, even as it sometimes deepened frustration. Money supported this change by translating obligation into clear terms. Clear terms allowed closure. Once an obligation was settled, attention could move on. The system did not require lingering acknowledgement. Life continued. This efficiency mattered in large populations where unresolved claims would accumulate endlessly. Yet closure came at a cost. Some experiences resisted final settlement. Loss, effort, and sacrifice could not always be captured fully by exchange. People sensed this gap intuitively. They spoke of things money could not replace, even as they relied on it daily. This awareness never disappeared. It surfaced in custom, language, and restraint. Certain spaces remained protected from exchange. Certain values resisted pricing. These boundaries varied across cultures and eras, but they existed everywhere. Money adapted by stopping short. It did not attempt to absorb everything. It remained limited in scope. This limitation preserved social balance. It prevented the system from claiming authority over meaning itself. Over time, societies refined these boundaries repeatedly. What could be exchanged expanded in some periods and contracted in others. Each expansion tested comfort. Each contraction reflected caution. Money adjusted without argument, responding to use rather than principle. Use determined legitimacy. If people accepted exchange, it continued. If they resisted, it narrowed. This responsiveness kept money embedded in daily life rather than imposed upon it. As generations passed, people inherited not just systems, but assumptions about fairness embedded within them. These assumptions shaped behavior unconsciously. They influenced what felt reasonable, what felt excessive, and what felt unacceptable. Money carried these assumptions forward, not as written rules alone, but as habit. Habit is more powerful than instruction. It guides action without demanding reflection. Money worked through habit more than through persuasion. This habit-based operation made systems durable. Durability did not mean absence of change. It meant slow change, gradual adjustment, correction through use rather than decree. When pressure built, behavior shifted first. Systems followed. Fairness, like trust, was negotiated continuously through this process. It was never settled permanently. It adapted to circumstance, scale, and shared tolerance. Money provided a framework within which this negotiation could occur without constant confrontation. That framework was imperfect. It could not feel. It could not judge context. It could only apply rules consistently. Human judgment filled the gaps where necessary. This division of labor persisted. Money handled structure. People handled meaning. As long as this balance held, systems remained workable. When it strained, attention returned to boundaries. Adjustments followed. The system continued. From barter to coins, from coins to records, from records to layered abstractions, each stage altered how fairness was perceived and practiced. Each stage traded flexibility for coordination. People accepted these trades because coordination was necessary. Large societies cannot function on discretion alone. They require standardization. Money provides that standardization, even when it feels incomplete. Incomplete systems can endure if they are understood as incomplete. Money survived because it never claimed to be enough on its own. It operated alongside judgment, custom, and care. It handled what could be measured and left the rest to human response. This coexistence allowed complexity to grow without erasing humanity entirely. And so the story continues, not as a search for perfect fairness, but as an ongoing attempt to balance clarity with compassion, structure with context, and coordination with care. Money remains part of that attempt, quietly shaping expectations, organizing obligation, and enabling cooperation, while leaving space for the parts of human life that cannot be reduced to numbers. It moves forward with society, adjusting slowly, reflecting shared tolerance, and remaining present not because it resolves every question, but because it allows life to proceed despite unanswered ones. As these understandings of fairness settled into practice, money also began to influence how people related to effort across generations. In early life, effort was closely tied to immediate outcome. What you worked for was usually consumed or used within your own lifetime. The horizon was short. Continuity depended more on tradition than on stored value. Money extended that horizon. Effort could now outlast the person who made it. Work done today could support someone tomorrow. Value could be transferred across time without being transformed. This made intergenerational cooperation practical rather than symbolic. Parents could prepare for children they would not always be present to protect. Communities could build structures meant to endure beyond the memory of their builders. Money allowed effort to accumulate rather than dissolve. This accumulation changed expectations. People began to feel connected not only to those around them, but to those who would come after. Responsibility stretched forward. Decisions acquired weight because their effects would persist. This awareness was not abstract. It was lived through routine actions. Saving rather than consuming, maintaining rather than exhausting, passing forward rather than using completely. Money provided the mechanism, but behavior carried the meaning. Yet this extension also introduced distance. Those who benefited from past effort were often far removed from those who made it. Gratitude faded. Obligation weakened. Value appeared without visible origin. Money preserved effort, but not memory. This loss of memory was inevitable. No system can carry intention indefinitely. Over time, value becomes detached from its source. What remains is structure, rules, expectation, habit. Money carries habit better than it carries story. Societies responded by embedding story elsewhere. Through education, through ritual, through custom, these practices attempted to reconnect present benefit with past effort, even as money continued to move impersonally. This division persisted. Money handled transfer. Culture handled mining. As long as both existed, continuity held. When one weakened, imbalance appeared. Too much structure without meaning felt hollow. Too much meaning without structure felt fragile. Societies moved between these states repeatedly. Money adjusted alongside these movements. It did not preserve memory, but it allowed preparation. It did not enforce responsibility, but it enabled it. It provided the means, not the motive. Motive remained human. Over long spans of time, this separation shaped how people thought about inheritance, obligation, and legacy. Money made legacy possible without requiring presence. It allowed contribution beyond lifespan, but it also introduced inequality that persisted beyond individual action. Advantage and disadvantage could compound quietly. Over time, these accumulations shaped experience profoundly. Societies grappled with this continuously. Rules were adjusted. Customs evolved. Interventions appeared and receded. Money reflected these attempts without resolving them. It carried outcomes forward regardless of intention. This neutrality was both strength and limitation. Money did not judge the past. It did not correct it automatically. It preserved continuity, not fairness. Fairness required deliberate effort beyond exchange. Understanding this took time. People learned that money could not be relied upon to balance history. It could only carry it. What it carried depended on how it was used. This realization shaped restraint. Boundaries emerged around accumulation. Expectations formed around stewardship. None of these were universal or permanent. They shifted with tolerance and circumstance. Money adapted to these boundaries rather than defining them. Through all of this, the essential function remained unchanged: to allow effort to move beyond immediacy, to allow coordination across time, to support cooperation where memory alone was insufficient. This function remained necessary. As long as people cared about those beyond themselves, as long as they planned beyond the present moment, as long as they sought continuity beyond personal lifespan, some mechanism for carrying effort forward would exist. Money remains one such mechanism. It does not guarantee wise use. It does not ensure equitable outcome. It simply allows connection across time that would otherwise be impossible. The rest depends on human judgment. That judgment evolves slowly. It reflects experience. It responds to imbalance. It learns unevenly. Money moves alongside it, neither leading nor stopping it, but providing the structure within which adjustment can occur. And so the movement continues, unhurried, shaped by how people relate to past effort and future responsibility, carried forward by routine actions repeated across generations, sustaining cooperation in a world where time extends beyond any single life, and where continuity must be built rather than assumed. As this intergenerational continuity became part of ordinary thinking, money also began to shape how people understood belonging. In early communities, belonging was defined by place, kinship, and shared history. You belonged where you were known. Exchange reinforced this belonging because it depended on familiarity. To trade was to participate in the life of a group. Money loosened this bond. Because value could move independently of identity, people could participate in exchange without belonging in the same way. A person could arrive, trade, and leave. Acceptance no longer required shared past. It required only adherence to rules. This shift expanded opportunity. People were no longer fixed to a single community for survival. They could move, adapt, and rebuild elsewhere. Money allowed participation without deep integration. Belonging became less necessary for exchange. Yet the need for belonging did not disappear. It shifted location. People sought belonging outside of transaction. In family, belief, craft, and shared purpose. Money handled coordination. Belongings handled meaning. This separation reshaped social life quietly. Economic interaction became neutral territory. Cultural and personal life carried emotional weight. People learned to move between these domains, adjusting expectations accordingly. This adjustment reduced conflict. When exchange does not demand agreement on identity, difference becomes easier to tolerate. People can cooperate without resolving deeper questions. Money provided this neutral space. Neutrality, however, is not warmth. It allows coexistence, not connection. Communities learn to maintain connection through other means. Rituals, shared stories, and collective memory preserved what exchange alone could not. Money did not replace these practices. It reduced their burden. As societies grew more complex, layers of belonging emerged. Local, regional, cultural, institutional. People participated in many at once. Money moved across all layers, indifferent to identity. This indifference was functional. It prevented constant renegotiation. It allowed systems to scale. It also meant that exclusion and inclusion could be managed structurally rather than personally. This management brought stability. Rules replaced discretion. Access followed criteria rather than familiarity. Predictability increased. So did impersonality. People accepted this trade because it reduced uncertainty. Knowing the rules mattered more than knowing the people. Money reinforced this by rewarding compliance over connection. Yet connection remained essential. Without it, life would feel hollow. People balanced the efficiency of money with the richness of belonging elsewhere. This balance varied across cultures and eras, but the pattern remained. Money stayed in its lane. It coordinated exchange. It did not define identity. When money was allowed to define belonging, tension followed. Societies pushed back, reasserting boundaries. Identity resisted quantification. Meaning resisted standardization. Money adapted by retreating to its functional role. This retreat preserved its usefulness. Over long periods, people became skilled at navigating this division. They knew where money applied and where it did not. They learned when neutrality was helpful and when presence was required. This knowledge was rarely articulated. It was learned through experience, through discomfort, through correction, through repetition. Money systems evolved alongside this learning, shaped by how people actually lived rather than how systems were designed. As belonging diversified, cooperation expanded. People no longer needed to share origin to share effort. They could participate in common projects without merging identities. Money enabled this cooperation by providing a common reference that did not demand agreement on meaning. This achievement was quiet but profound. It allowed large, diverse societies to function. It allowed difference without constant conflict. It allowed collaboration across boundaries that would otherwise be impassable. At the same time, it required vigilance. Neutral systems can overlook exclusion. Rules can harden. Impersonality can become neglect. Societies responded by adjusting boundaries repeatedly, expanding access, restricting misuse, refining criteria. Money reflected these adjustments without judgment. It did not decide who belonged. It followed decisions made elsewhere. It carried outcomes forward. Through all of this, money remained a tool rather than a source of identity. It facilitated participation without defining worth. It enabled cooperation without demanding sameness. This limitation preserved social flexibility. Belonging remained a human matter. Exchange remained a systemic one. Each operated best within its domain. As long as this distinction held, societies remained adaptable. When it blurred, tension rose. Correction followed. The story of money is intertwined with these corrections. It moves forward not by absorbing everything, but by stopping short, by remaining incomplete, by leaving space for what cannot be standardized. This incompleteness is not a weakness. It is what allows money to coexist with the full range of human life. And so the movement continues, shaped by how people balance neutrality with belonging, efficiency with meaning, coordination with connection. Money remains present wherever cooperation is needed, quiet and functional, carrying value across boundaries, while human beings carry identity, memory, and purpose in ways no system of exchange ever could. The two move together, intersecting but not merging, sustaining complex societies through an ongoing negotiation that never fully resolves, but continues patiently, one ordinary exchange at a time. As this balance between neutrality and belonging became familiar, money also began to shape how people understood dignity. In earlier life, dignity was closely tied to role and recognition. A person's standing came from contribution that could be seen and acknowledged directly. Work was witnessed. Skill was known. Respect followed familiarity. Money altered this visibility. Effort could now be exchanged without being understood. A person's work might travel far from them. Its result might be used by someone who never knew its source. Payment replaced recognition. Dignity became quieter, less public. This change was subtle. Money did not remove dignity. It changed where it lived. Respect shifted from public acknowledgement to private autonomy. Being able to meet obligations without dependence became a form of dignity. Privacy itself gained value. People learned to accept compensation without explanation. They did not need to justify effort. They did not need approval from those they served. Money allowed contribution to stand on its own, separate from personal validation. This separation was liberating for many. It reduced exposure. It allowed people to maintain self-respect without seeking affirmation. Exchange became a way to participate without submitting identity to judgment. Yet something was lost. When recognition fades, work can feel invisible. Contribution can feel detached from meaning. Dignity rooted only in autonomy can become fragile when autonomy is strained. Societies responded by cultivating other forms of recognition. Titles, honors, rituals, and shared narratives continued alongside monetary exchange. These practices acknowledged what money could not express. Money handled settlement. Culture handled esteem. This division was necessary. Money could not measure care, creativity, or sacrifice fully. Attempts to do so often felt hollow. People learned to rely on different systems for different needs. Over time, dignity became layered. There was dignity in earning, dignity in independence, dignity in belongings. Money supported some layers and left others untouched. This partial role allowed it to function without claiming authority over the whole person. As systems grew larger, this partiality protected individuals. In impersonal environments, money provided a way to interact without surrendering selfhood. A transaction could occur without intrusion. Boundaries were respected. Boundaries matter. They allow people to participate without being consumed by systems. Money provided clear edges to interaction. Once an exchange was complete, obligation ended. Attention could return to personal life. This closure preserved energy. Without it, people would be entangled endlessly. Money allowed disentanglement. It simplified relationships where intimacy was unnecessary. Yet simplicity carried risk. When everything becomes transactional, dignity can thin. People sense when exchange replaces regard entirely. Societies react to this sensing by reasserting boundaries around what should not be priced. These reactions recur across history. They appear as norms, taboos, and protected spaces. Money respects these boundaries when they are widely held. It retreats when resistance grows. This responsiveness preserves legitimacy. Money does not insist on relevance everywhere. It survives by remaining useful where accepted and absent where rejected. This flexibility allows dignity to remain rooted in multiple sources. As generations adapted, people grew accustomed to navigating these layers. They understood when money applied and when it did not. This understanding was not taught explicitly. It was learned through experience. Money systems evolved alongside this learning. They incorporated protections. They recognized limits. They left room for human judgment. Not perfectly, but enough to endure. From barter to coins, from coins to records, from records to layered abstractions, money has continually reshaped how people experience dignity without defining it completely. It offered independence. It offered privacy. It offered autonomy. It did not offer meanings. Meaning remained elsewhere. This separation allowed societies to grow complex without reducing people to numbers entirely. It allowed coordination without erasing personhood. As long as this separation holds, money remains workable. When it strains, correction follows. Boundaries are redrawn. Expectations adjust. Money adapts. And so the story continues, shaped by how people protect dignity within systems that require impersonality, how they balance autonomy with recognition, and how they preserve selfhood while participating in structures far larger than themselves. Money remains present in this negotiation, quiet and functional, enabling exchange without demanding identity, supporting cooperation without defining worth, and continuing its long role as a tool that helps people live together without asking them to be the same. As this layered sense of dignity settled into ordinary life, money also began to influence how people understood dependence. In early communities, dependence was visible and mutual. People relied on one another openly. Help was given and received within shared awareness. Dependence did not carry shame because it was expected. Survival required it. Money altered this visibility. Because obligations could be settled impersonally, dependence became less obvious. A person could receive support without direct acknowledgement. Assistance could arrive through systems rather than faces. This reduced exposure. Reduced exposure changed perception. Dependence began to feel private rather than shared. People could meet needs without revealing vulnerability. Money allowed this discretion. It softened the social cost of needing help. For many, this was a relief. It preserved dignity in moments of strain. It allowed participation without explanation. It reduced the emotional burden of reliance. Yet invisibility carried its own cost. When dependence is hidden, mutual awareness weakens. People may underestimate how much they rely on systems and on one another. Independence can appear absolute when it is not. Money does not create this illusion. It enables it. By routing support through structure, it removes the signs of interdependence that once kept communities closely attuned. People feel self-sufficient even when they are deeply connected. This feeling is partial. No one lives independently of systems. Food, shelter, safety, and continuity all depend on coordination beyond the individual. Money allows this coordination to operate without constant recognition. Recognition fades. Function remains. Societies learned to live with this trade. They accepted that visible dependence could be reduced in exchange for broader stability. They relied on systems to handle what once required direct reciprocity. This reliance required trust. Trust that systems would continue to function. Trust that obligations would be met. Trust that support would be available when needed. Money carried this trust forward quietly. When trust held, dependence felt manageable. When trust weakened, dependence became visible again. People sought reassurance. They looked for tangible support. They reconnected with proximity. These movements occurred repeatedly. Money did not prevent them. It accommodated them. It allowed dependence to expand and contract with confidence. As dependence became mediated, responsibility shifted. Instead of owing specific individuals, people owed systems. Instead of gratitude toward neighbors, they felt obligation toward structure. Payment replaced thanks. Compliance replaced reciprocity. This shift reduced emotional complexity. Relationships were simpler. Expectations clearer. Conflict reduced. Money supported this simplicity by closing obligations cleanly. Yet simplicity could feel empty. Human beings seek acknowledgement as well as resolution. When systems resolved needs without recognition, something felt missing. Societies responded by maintaining spaces where dependence remained personal. Family, friendship, and community retained roles money could not fill. Money learned to stop short. It handled coordination. It left care to human connection. This boundary preserved emotional life while allowing scale. Over time, people became adept at navigating these layers of dependence. They accepted support from systems without shame. They offered support personally where meaning mattered. This navigation was learned, not designed. Money systems evolved alongside it, shaped by how people actually lived with dependence rather than how theory imagined it. From barter to coins, from coins to records, from records to layered abstractions, money continually redefined how dependence was experienced. It made reliance less visible. It made vulnerability more private. It made coordination broader. These changes allowed societies to grow larger and more complex without demanding constant emotional exchange. They also required care to preserve human connection. That care remains ongoing. Money does not replace dependence. It reframes it. People still rely on one another. They simply do so through systems that make reliance quieter and more manageable. This quietness is both a strength and a risk. When systems work, quiet dependence feels like independence. When systems strain, quiet dependence becomes suddenly apparent. At those moments, people remember what had faded from view. That coordination is fragile. That support is shared. That independence is relative. Money absorbs this remembering and then, as stability returns, allows forgetting again. This cycle continues. It is not deception. It is adaptation. As long as people seek dignity alongside cooperation, autonomy alongside reliance, money will continue to mediate dependence in this way, shaping how people experience support without demanding constant acknowledgement of it. And so the story moves forward, patient and unannounced, carried by ordinary use, shaped by trust and strain, allowing people to live within large systems while feeling, most of the time, as though they stand on their own. As this long movement settles, it does not arrive at a final answer. Money never resolves dependence, dignity, trust, or fairness. It only reshapes how these are experienced. It makes cooperation possible at a scale that memory, proximity, and personal relationship alone cannot sustain. In doing so, it asks people to accept distance, abstraction, and routine in exchange for continuity. From barter to coins, from coins to paper, from paper to layered systems of record and promise, the path has never been straight or intentional. Each change emerged from necessity. Each solution solved one problem and introduced another. Over time, people adjusted their behavior, and systems followed. Money endured not because it was perfect, but because it was sufficient. Sufficient to carry effort forward in time. Sufficient to allow strangers to cooperate. Sufficient to make uncertainty livable. It did not replace human judgment, care, or meaning. It moved alongside them, handling what could be standardized and stepping back where it could not. Even now, money remains incomplete by design. That incompleteness is what allows it to coexist with human life rather than consume it. It leaves space for dignity, belonging, and care to exist beyond transaction. The story, then, does not close. It continues quietly, shaped by ordinary actions repeated day after day. Payments made, obligations honored, trust extended just far enough to allow movement to continue. Adjustments occurring slowly, often unnoticed, until they become part of the background once again. Money remains part of that background, not as a force that decides, but as a structure that responds, reflecting how people live, cooperate, and adapt within the limits of time, knowledge, and trust. If this calm exploration of history felt worth staying with, you can support this series by liking the episode, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who appreciate long, reflective listening.